Many people believe that fat only starts to decrease when you train very hard, sweat a lot, your heart beats fast, and you breathe heavily. But if you look from a physiological perspective, that is not when the body decides to burn fat. That is only when the body spends energy quickly. These two things are not exactly the same. In the human body, whether fat is stored or released does not depend on how exhausted you feel, but on hormone signals, nervous system signals, and the metabolic state inside the cells. This means that you can train very hard and still not burn much fat. And on the contrary, you can simply walk steadily without feeling exhausted. Yet the body may begin to open the energy stores that have been kept for a long time. If you look deeper, fat in the body is not something that lies still waiting to be burned, but a storage system that is very tightly controlled. Fat cells store energy in the form of triglycerides, and they only release energy when they receive the correct signal. That signal comes from the coordination of the sympathetic nervous system, hormones such as insulin, glucagon, adrenaline, and the activity of the muscles. When insulin is high, the body is programmed to keep energy stored. When insulin decreases and the signal of movement appears, the body understands that energy needs to be used. This explains why many people eat less, train more, but fat still does not decrease, because their hormonal environment is still in storage mode, not in release mode. Interestingly, one of the most natural ways to send the signal to release fat is not running, not high-intensity training, but walking. When you start walking, within the first few minutes, the nervous system already recognizes that the body is moving from a resting state to an active state. The heart rate rises slightly, blood flow changes, insulin begins to decrease, and the hormones that mobilize energy increase at a moderate level, enough to activate fat breakdown without creating too much stress for the body. From a biological point of view, this is a very special state, because it allows the body to use fat as fuel without disturbing the endocrine system. Many studies in exercise physiology show that the body does not switch to burning fat immediately when you start moving, but must go through a transition phase. In the first minutes, the body prefers to use glucose in the blood and glycogen in the muscles. But when movement continues at a moderate intensity, insulin gradually decreases. Fat-breaking enzymes begin to work, and fat cells receive the signal that stored energy can be used. This is why long, steady activities such as continuous walking can activate fat burning much more effectively than short but very intense activities. One thing that many people do not realize is that the body does not decide to burn fat based only on how many calories you use, but on the biological environment you create. If that environment is stress, lack of sleep, high insulin, high cortisol, the body will prefer to keep energy to survive. But if that environment is steady movement, stable heart rate, balanced hormones, the body will switch to using fat naturally. Walking, even though simple, is one of the clearest signals that tells the body there is no need to store anymore. It is time to use. In this video, we will not speak in general advice, like walk more or exercise every day. We will go through each stage that happens inside the body, minute by minute, to understand exactly what happens to fat cells, to hormones, to the nervous system, and to energy metabolism. When you begin to walk, when you understand this mechanism, you will see that fat loss is not a matter of willpower, but a matter of biological signals. And if the signal is changed in the right way, the body can do the rest by itself. Part 1. The first 10 minutes. The body shifts from using sugar to opening the fat stores. After you start walking, the body does not burn fat immediately. This is the point that many people misunderstand. In the first minutes, the body's energy system always prioritizes the easiest fuel to use, which is glucose in the blood and glycogen stored in the muscles and the liver. This is not because the body does not want to burn fat, but because biologically, glucose is the energy source that can be used the fastest when the muscles have just begun to work. When muscle fibers contract continuously, they need ATP immediately, and glucose can be converted into ATP faster than fatty acids. Therefore, in the first few minutes, you are almost using sugar, not fat. But at the same time, a more important process is silently beginning, which is the change in the hormonal environment. When movement is light and continuous, like walking, the sympathetic nervous system is activated at a moderate level. The adrenal glands begin to release a small amount of adrenaline and noradrenaline, not enough to make you shake or feel stressed, but enough to send a signal to the tissues in the body that the resting state has ended. At the same time, the pancreas reduces insulin secretion. This is an important shift, because insulin is the main hormone that makes the body keep energy stored in fat cells. When insulin decreases, fat cells are no longer tightly locked. At the same time, glucagon increases slightly. This hormone works opposite to insulin, meaning it promotes the release of stored energy. With only a small change between insulin and glucagon, the metabolic environment of the body has already shifted from storage to mobilization. In the period from about the 2nd minute to the 5th minute, the body begins to shift from using glucose in the blood to using stored glycogen. This is the intermediate step before fat is used. When glycogen begins to decrease, receptors on the surface of fat cells receive signals from adrenaline and noradrenaline. These signals attach to beta-adrenergic receptors on fat cells, activating a chain of biochemical reactions inside the cell. The result of this chain reaction is that the enzyme hormone-sensitive lipase is prepared to work. This enzyme acts like the key that opens the fat storage, but it only works when the hormonal environment allows it. From about the 6th minute to the 10th minute, the fat-breaking process begins more clearly. Triglycerides in fat cells are split into glycerol and free fatty acids. These fatty acids do not move to the muscles by themselves, but are transported in the blood by carrier proteins, mainly albumin. When they reach the muscles, the fatty acids are moved into the mitochondria, where they are oxidized to produce energy. This process is slower than using glucose, but more efficient during long activity. This is why continuous walking at a steady pace creates favorable conditions for the body to switch to burning fat, not because walking burns many calories each minute, but because it allows the body to maintain the correct hormonal state long enough for fat breakdown to truly happen. An important point that exercise physiology studies have shown is that the shift to fat burning does not happen immediately when you start moving, but needs time for the nervous system, hormones, and enzymes to synchronize with each other. If the activity is too short, the body does not have enough time to change its state. If the activity is too intense, the body returns to prioritizing sugar, but when movement is moderate and long enough, such as continuous walking, the body enters a metabolic zone where fatty acids become the main source of energy. This is exactly the stage that many people do not notice, because the feeling on the outside is nothing special, but inside, fat cells have already begun to open their storage. Understanding this stage is very important, because it explains why many people train a lot but do not lose fat, while those who maintain light but consistent movement change clearly over time. The body does not respond to effort, but responds to biological signals. And during the first 10 minutes of walking, That signal is being built step by step, preparing for the stage when fat burning truly increases. Part 2. After 20 minutes, the body truly enters fat burning mode, and visceral fat is mobilized first. When you continue walking for about 15 to 20 minutes, the body begins to enter a stable metabolic state, and this is when the use of fat as fuel becomes clear. At this point, the glucose in the blood has been used at a moderate level. Glycogen in the muscles starts to decrease. Insulin stays low, while adrenaline and noradrenaline remain at a level that is enough to stimulate energy release, but not high enough to create stress. This balance creates the ideal biological environment for fat cells to continue releasing fatty acids into the blood, and for the muscles to use them as the main fuel source. This state is called, in exercise physiology, the fat oxidation dominant state, meaning the body prefers burning fat rather than burning sugar. In this stage, the role of the mitochondria becomes very important. Mitochondria are where fatty acids are oxidized to produce ATP. And when movement continues at a moderate intensity, mitochondria work more efficiently than during high-intensity exercise. When the activity is too hard, the body needs energy quickly, so it goes back to using glucose. But when the movement is steady, the heart rate rises moderately. Oxygen supply is sufficient, and fatty acids can be burned slowly but continuously. This explains why walking, even though it does not make you exhausted, can maintain the fat-burning state longer than short, high-intensity workouts. A very interesting point that many people do not know is that in this stage, the body does not mobilize fat randomly. Studies in metabolism show that visceral fat is often mobilized before the body uses a large amount of subcutaneous fat. The reason is that visceral fat has more blood vessels, has more hormone-sensitive receptors, and responds faster to adrenaline and noradrenaline. From a biological point of view, visceral fat is also the type of fat the body prefers to reduce first, because when it accumulates too much, it is related to inflammation, insulin resistance, lipid disorders, and many metabolic diseases. Therefore, when the body receives a prolonged movement signal, it tends to mobilize the energy source that is easier to access and more beneficial for health first. And in many cases, that source is visceral fat. At the same time, blood flow to fat tissue increases. When you move continuously, the small blood vessels in the muscles and in fat tissue dilate, allowing fatty acids to be transported more easily from fat cells into the blood, and then from the blood to the muscles. If circulation is poor, fat may remain stored even when hormones have already allowed its release. This is why light but prolonged movement is beneficial for fat loss, because it improves circulation without creating an excessive stress response. When the body is under high stress, cortisol increases, and cortisol tends to keep fat stored, especially fat around the abdomen. In contrast, when movement is moderate, cortisol does not rise too high, and the hormonal environment remains favorable for fat use. Between about 20 and 30 minutes, the body also begins to adapt to using fatty acids as fuel. Enzymes involved in fat oxidation work more efficiently. The transport channels that move fatty acids into the mitochondria become more active, and the muscles become accustomed to using fat instead of depending only on sugar. This is a form of metabolic training, not muscle training in the sense of strength, but training of the energy system. When this state is repeated many times over many days, the body learns to switch to fat burning faster in later activity. What is important at this stage is that the external feeling is still very normal. You do not feel extremely hot. You do not feel exhausted. You may even feel more comfortable than at the beginning. But precisely because the intensity is not too high, the nervous system, hormones, and metabolism can maintain a stable state long enough for fat breakdown to continue. This is the major difference between movement to spend energy and movement to change metabolism. When the goal is fat loss, especially visceral fat, the important thing is not to train as hard as possible, but to create the biological state in which the body is willing to use the energy that has been stored, and after about 20 minutes of continuous walking, that state truly begins. Part 3. After 40 to 60 minutes, the heart, blood vessels, and enzymes begin to change. The body not only burns fat, but also reprograms metabolism. When you continue walking past the 30-minute mark and move closer to 40 or 50 minutes, the body not only maintains the fat-burning state, but begins to activate deeper mechanisms related to the cardiovascular system and the endocrine system. At this point, the heart rate has stabilized at a moderate level for long enough that the blood vessels dilate. Circulation increases, and oxygen is continuously supplied to the muscles. This process of vessel dilation, called vasodilation, not only helps you move more easily, but also makes the oxidation of fatty acids in the mitochondria more efficient. Because burning fat requires more oxygen than burning glucose. When oxygen supply is sufficient, the body tends to continue using fat instead of switching back to sugar. This is why prolonged activity at moderate intensity often creates a more favorable biological environment for fat loss than very intense but short exercise. At this stage, the heart does not only pump blood, but also directly participates in metabolic regulation. When the heart works steadily for a long enough time, it releases a hormone called atrial natriuretic peptide, often abbreviated as ANP. This hormone has been studied in cardiovascular physiology because it helps increase salt excretion and regulate blood pressure. But later studies show that ANP also stimulates fat breakdown. It acts directly on fat cells, increasing the activity of enzymes that break down triglycerides, allowing more fatty acids to be released into the blood. This means that when you walk long enough for the heart to work at a stable level, the body does not burn fat only because it needs energy, but also because hormones from the heart are supporting the process. This is one of the less commonly discussed mechanisms, yet it explains why endurance-type activities such as walking, light cycling, or slow running can improve fat metabolism very clearly over time. At the same time as ANP, another important enzyme begins to change its activity during prolonged movement, and that enzyme is lipoprotein lipase, often called LPL. This enzyme is located on the walls of blood vessels and has the role of processing fat circulating in the blood. When the body is inactive, LPL activity is higher in fat tissue, making it easier for fat to be taken back and stored. But when you walk regularly, especially when you walk long enough, LPL activity increases in the muscles and decreases in fat tissue. This causes fatty acids to be directed into the muscles to be used as energy instead of returning to fat cells. Studies in exercise physiology show that just one walking session of about 45 minutes can increase LPL activity in the muscles for many hours afterward. This means the metabolic change does not stop when you stop walking, but continues after that. At the same time, the body begins to show the effect known in physiology as excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC. This is the state in which after activity, the body still uses more energy than normal to recover, repair tissue, restore glycogen, and rebalance the internal system. During this period, the body continues to use fatty acids as the main energy source. This means a long walking session does not only help burn fat during movement, but also creates a period afterward when metabolism remains higher than normal. When this happens repeatedly over many days, the total amount of energy taken from fat can become much greater than what you feel during the exercise itself. An even deeper change happens at the cellular level. When muscles work continuously for a long time, an energy-sensing protein called AMPK is activated. AMPK can be seen as a switch that tells the cell that energy is being used a lot, and that the ability to produce energy needs to increase in the future. When AMPK is active, it stimulates the creation of more mitochondria, increases the ability to oxidize fat, and improves insulin sensitivity. This does not happen immediately in a single walk, but the signal begins to appear when movement lasts long enough. And if repeated regularly, the body adapts in the direction of using fat more efficiently. This is exactly why people who maintain light but consistent activity for many weeks often see clear changes in their body, even though they do not train very hard. What is important at this stage is that fat loss is no longer only about energy expenditure, but becomes an adjustment of the entire system. The heart, blood vessels, enzymes, hormones, and mitochondria all participate in deciding whether the body will store energy or use energy. When you walk long enough and consistently enough, these signals gradually synchronize with each other, and the body begins to shift into a state that naturally prefers using fat. This is why many studies in metabolism show that the greatest effect of exercise does not come from the highest intensity, but from the ability to maintain a stable biological state long enough for the body to adapt. And once adaptation happens, fat burning does not only occur while you are walking, but continues for many hours afterward. Part 4. When walking every day, the body begins to change at the level of mitochondria, hormones, and the brain. If one walking session can activate fat burning for a few hours, then walking repeatedly every day can change the way the body manages energy over the long term. This is a point that modern physiology has shown very clearly. Fat loss is not only about burning calories in a single workout, but about the adaptation of the entire metabolic system. When the body receives the same movement signal again and again, it begins to adjust cell structure, enzyme activity, and hormone balance in a way that fits a regularly active state. This explains why people who maintain daily walking often see gradual changes in their body, even without heavy training or extreme dieting. Yet fat still decreases and energy becomes more stable. One of the most important changes happens in the mitochondria. Mitochondria are the place where energy is produced inside the cell, and also where fatty acids are oxidized to make ATP. When you move regularly at moderate intensity, the body receives the signal that it needs to produce energy in a more sustainable way. Not only depending on glucose, the protein AMPK and other regulatory factors activate a process called mitochondrial biogenesis, which means creating more mitochondria in the muscles. When the number of mitochondria increases, the body becomes able to burn fat more efficiently even during light activity. This does not happen after one session, but studies in exercise physiology show that after only a few weeks of consistent movement, the body's ability to oxidize fat can increase noticeably, and the person will switch to using fat as fuel earlier than before. Along with the change in mitochondria comes an improvement in insulin sensitivity. In modern life, many people eat frequently, sit for long periods, and do not sleep enough, causing insulin to stay high for most of the day. When insulin is high, fat cells receive the signal to keep energy stored, and fat breakdown is suppressed. Walking every day helps lower baseline insulin, and at the same time makes muscle cells more sensitive to insulin when you eat. This means energy from food is more likely to go into the muscles to be used or stored as glycogen. Instead of being converted into triglycerides in fat cells, studies in people with insulin resistance show that simply increasing light daily movement can significantly improve blood sugar control. And when blood sugar becomes stable, the hormonal environment becomes more favorable for fat loss. Another change that is less noticed but very important is the adjustment of stress hormones. Chronically high cortisol can increase fat storage, especially in the abdominal area, and at the same time reduce insulin sensitivity. Very intense workouts, poor sleep, or prolonged stress can all keep cortisol at a high level. Walking at a moderate pace has the opposite effect. It helps the nervous system gradually shift from a stress state to a balanced state, lowering baseline cortisol over time. When cortisol becomes stable, the body can more easily move into a state of using energy instead of storing it. This is why many people do not change their diet very much. But when they begin to maintain the habit of walking every day, their waist size still gradually decreases. Not because they burn more calories in each session, but because their hormonal environment has changed. Regular walking also affects the brain, and this indirectly influences fat loss. When movement is consistent, blood flow to the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex increases. These are the areas related to memory, behavior control, and decision-making. When the activity of these areas improves, people tend to control eating better, sleep better, and respond to stress in a more stable way. These factors do not directly burn fat, but they determine the long-term biological environment of the body. Studies in behavior and metabolism show that people who maintain light regular activity tend to eat less naturally, not because of effort, but because the system that regulates hunger and fullness works more steadily. When these changes happen at the same time, the body becomes more flexible in metabolism, a state often called metabolic flexibility. A flexible body can switch easily between using glucose and using fat, depending on activity level and food intake. In contrast, when the body loses this flexibility, it becomes dependent on sugar, feels tired more easily when hungry, stores fat more easily when eating more, and has difficulty losing fat even with exercise. Walking every day is one of the simplest ways to restore this flexibility, because it creates a signal strong enough to activate the energy system without causing excessive stress. When flexibility is restored, fat loss no longer depends on a single workout, but becomes the natural result of a metabolic system working correctly. Understanding this is very important, because it changes the way we look at fat loss. The problem is not finding the exercise that burns the most calories, but creating the biological environment that makes the body ready to use the energy it has stored. When walking is repeated every day, the body gradually relearns how to do this. And once the system has changed, fat loss becomes more stable and much easier to maintain compared to relying only on very intense training for a short period of time. Part 5. Conclusion. The problem is not that you train too little, but that the biological signals are wrong. When looking at the entire process, it becomes clear that fat loss is not something that happens in a single workout, but the result of many biological signals repeated long enough for the body to change the way it manages energy. In the first minutes of walking, the body only shifts from a resting state to an active state. After that, hormones begin to change. Enzymes begin to activate. Fat cells begin to open their storage. Mitochondria increase their activity. Blood vessels dilate. The heart releases hormones that support fat breakdown. And when this process is repeated over many days, the body even changes cell structure and the metabolic system itself. This shows that the problem for many people is not that they do not try hard enough, but that they are creating signals that do not match the way the body is designed to use energy. In biology, the human body always prioritizes survival before fat loss. If the signals the body receives are lack of sleep, high stress, high insulin, irregular eating, and inconsistent movement, the endocrine system interprets that the environment is not safe. And in that environment, keeping energy stored is the logical choice. In that state, even if you train very hard, the body tends to conserve energy, slow metabolism, and reduce fat-burning efficiency. In contrast, when the signals the body receives are regular movement, stable heart rate, balanced hormones, enough sleep, and frequent use of energy, the biological system shifts into a safe state. And in that state, releasing fat becomes a natural response. Walking, even though simple, is one of the clearest signals to the body that energy is being used regularly and does not need to be stored excessively. This also explains why many metabolic studies in recent years no longer focus only on calories, but focus on the hormonal environment and metabolic flexibility. A flexible body can switch from burning sugar to burning fat without difficulty, while a body that has lost flexibility depends on glucose, becomes tired easily when hungry, and stores fat easily when eating more. Regular walking, especially at moderate intensity and long enough duration, is one of the most effective ways to restore that flexibility, because it activates the energy system without creating excessive stress. When metabolic flexibility improves, the body not only burns fat better during activity, but also manages energy better throughout the entire day. Another important point is that this process does not happen immediately, and it does not need to happen immediately. The body changes in the direction of what is repeated most often. If the movement signal appears once and then stops, the body will return to its previous state. But if that signal appears every day, even if it is only walking, the enzyme system, hormones, and mitochondria will gradually adapt. Once adaptation happens, the body begins to shift into a state where fat is used more easily, blood sugar stays more stable, and there is less tendency to store excess energy. This is why small but consistent changes often create bigger results than extreme efforts that last only a short time. From a physiological point of view, walking is not a simple exercise, but a very strong biological signal. It tells the nervous system that the body is active, tells the pancreas that insulin does not need to stay high, tells fat cells that energy can be released, tells the mitochondria that more energy needs to be produced, and tells the brain that the body is in a stable state. When all of these signals become synchronized, fat loss is no longer a fight against the body, but becomes a cooperative process. Therefore, instead of thinking that fat loss requires harder training, sometimes what is needed is to create the right environment so the body can do its own work. Walking every day, long enough for the body to switch into fat-using mode, and consistent enough for the metabolic system to adapt, is one of the simplest ways to do that. When you understand this mechanism, you will see that the body is not working against you. It is only reacting to the signals you send to it, and when the signal is correct, change will happen naturally, slowly, but very steadily.